Ago now to go to Selkirk Forestry School, and my very first summer I was hired by Parks Canada to do some whitebark pine surveys, and it took a couple of weeks before I discovered that this was the tree, it's the place to go, and this is what I want to more or less dedicate my career to, because it's well, you'll learn about it, and hopefully you'll pick up on why it's such an awesome tree to study and to learn about ecosystems and systems in general. So what I'm going to do is I'll start off by just giving sort of an overview of whitebark pine and what it is, what it looks like, the ecology, the problems with it, why it's an endangered species, what we're doing to try and recover the species, and then finally what it is that you guys can do to help. And spoiler alert, is to help find more whitebark pine. Okay, so you guys, I'm hoping, will spend some time up in the subalpine, and I'll show you guys a way to help us find more whitebark and do that. And as I'm going, I'm very relaxed. Any questions that come up, anything that's weird or wrong, blurt it out or start waving your hand. It's very relaxed. So, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on whitebark pine since 2003, but I've got this 7-year project. Came with funding from Columbia Basin Trust, top left. Their ecosystem enhancement program. So back in 2018, I got Nature Conservancy of Canada got multi-year funding to do a restoration project, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. And you'll see that sort of because of various aspects of the ecology and where it lives, it really takes a long time to restore the species, and so it's really hard to get a project done in a year. So I got a 5 or 7 year window to do this work, so that's fantastic. And then all sorts of other people, organizations are also involved in restoration. This slide could be a lot busier, but I sort of kept it to these folks. So apologies for, this is all pictures, there's no words that you're going to miss, so hopefully you can sort of see some of this. First of all, how many know what whitebark pine looks like? Okay, how many of you could identify where the whitebark pine is in this skyline here? These are the trees. We're up in the subalpine, so just below the tree line. And most trees up high, they're like carrots, right? They're straight up. They're spruce. This is a subalpine fir, and then a spruce might have a bit more branches, but they're really sort of pointy. Whitebark pine is this one here. It's more like a broccoli top, and it's got that branching pattern, which is very distinct, and so you can often see it. Like if there was some up on that ridge, you'd be able to see it just looks different. And it takes a little bit of practice to get to know it, but that's sort of your first clue when you're looking for whitebark pine, is looking for that broccoli kind of wolfy shape to it. This is what it looks like in wintertime. You can't see it here, you can't see it in wintertime either quite often. These are small ones obviously, but you guys all know how much snow we get around here. Trees are often buried. You got 3-4 meters of snow and snow ghosts. So part of the deal with whitebark pine is that it's like this for a significant part of its life, right? So it only really has 3 or 4 months a year to grow, so it grows really slowly. I planted some seedlings, some little seedlings back in 2013, and I was up there earlier this week, and the trees are now up to my knee. So 50 centimeters in almost a decade. And that's what their strategy is. They're really, because they exist at high elevation, they put the taproots down, and they live where it's really dry and can survive in quite dry habitat, as you'll see in some of these photos. So when they start out, they put the roots down and they have a little bit of shoot, but not a whole lot. So hopefully those guys will pick up steam in a little bit, but they are slow growing species. and it takes about 80 to 100 years before they start producing cones. I had meant, can you guys see this? Yeah, not really, eh? So, the cones, you'll hopefully appreciate why finding the cones themselves is really important. It's the key component of restoration. But it's these big purple cones. So I brought, there's some western white pine. Hopefully some of you guys will recognize this as a western white pine. This cone, this branch. Western white is a close cousin to whitebark pine. It's also a 5-needle pine. And so if you're trying to learn to identify your trees, and you've got a pine tree, you can tell this is a pine because it's got the longer needles. And they come in groups of 5. So every white pine, western white pine, whitebark pine, eastern white pine, limber pine, they're all in groups of 5. Ponderosa will be a group of 3. Lodgepole pine will be a group of 2, that kind of thing. So if you see something in the alpine that's got that sort of wolfy, broccoli shape, you go up close, it's got 5 needles, you're like, yeah, it's probably a whitebark. And then the clincher will be the cone itself. This is a western white cone, a western western white pine cone that's sort of longer. Whitebark pine, I really apologize, I meant to bring some, but they're sort of shorter, more apple-like. This is the shape here, and so it grows in a 2-year cycle. If you were able to see it, you can actually see this picture would have been taken in August or September, and there's some tiny little conelets that are like that big that are next year's cones, and so they'll be forming on the very tips of the branches, and then 1 year's growth in will be the mature cones, and then often you'll be able to see, I can't even see it from here, but you can see the older cones which are just look like this, look like that, but sort of are broken apart, and I'll talk about a little bit why they're broken apart.
You can see like 3 types of cones on a branch.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I took a picture of this because it's pretty rare to actually be able to see it all in one thing. It's a good sort of demo, but this time of year, the cones are getting close to being this big. They're really expanding. So maybe you can see this. This doesn't look right. So this is called White Pine Blister Rust. It's a fungus that is killing a lot of western white, well, all your white pines. So western white pine, often you'll see those guys have been decimated over the decades. And it was a big deal for the forest industry because western white pine used to be major commercial species and is no longer because it's essentially been largely wiped out from an economic perspective. And whitebark pine, exactly the same thing going on. In Western Canada, it's various amounts of death and destruction across the range. Some places there's very little, other places is like 90% of the trees are dead or infected. I'm going to talk about dark woods a little bit, and there we've got about 2/3 of the trees are either dead or dying from blister rust. So and what that is, it's a non-native fungus. It's a fungus that came in from Europe and Asia that's endemic to 5-needle pines over in Asia. And so the trees there are able to survive. It's just like a sickness rather than a disease that will actually kill the tree. Here, there's very little natural resistance to this blister rust, and this natural resistance is, when I start talking about restoration, we want to find about maybe somewhere between 1% and 5% of your whitebark pine trees actually have some resistance to blister rust, and those are the ones we're trying to collect cones from to propagate. So that's what I'll be talking about largely.
How does that rust spread?
It's a spore, so it's a pretty complicated life cycle, but it's so what happens is that these spores land on the needles. So they land and it would be on this western white pine. They land on the needles, and the spores germinate, and the hyphae grow in through the stomata, these little openings where the air gets exchanged, and grows down in through underneath the bark, and goes down in the tree. And then every year, every spring, we'll have these sort of that orangish yellow color. They're called cankers that come out, and then they burst and they release their spores. Those spores, they actually have to go land on an alternate host, either a ribes species or paintbrush, or there's a couple other species that are alternate hosts. And so in areas where there's lots of ribes, so we're talking black gooseberry, that kind of thing, they spend a year on the gooseberry. They get a different kind of a different stage in their life cycle. Like there's 5 different stages of the fungus, and then once they get released from the ribes, they go and they land on this and go like that. So that's sort of their cycle. And the spores themselves are ubiquitous. We can't ever get rid of them. They're here for good. So it's just a matter of trying to naturalize it. We're never going to eradicate all the spores in North America.
So if you see a really healthy whitebark in nature, then it's probably one of the
Yeah, it's either resistant or it's lucky.
Okay.
And I'll show you later how we try and differentiate between those two things. But those healthy ones, so when I'm looking for the healthy resistant tree, I want to go to a stand where 90% of them are dead or dying. And it's those 10% that I collect cones from,
right,
and we test those to see if they're actually resistant or if they're just lucky.
That seems like pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when you see a really healthy one, you probably see just as, you know, like 9 times that amount of unhealthy ones.
Yeah. 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 No, that's true. And so, yeah, when we're talking about collecting, it's you want to find a place where there's where there's a lot of cones. So often you'll get trees, but the cones aren't accessible for various reasons, because the trees are too high, or there's not a high enough density of trees to make it worthwhile. That's sort of, yeah, that's more site specific stuff. So the project, I don't know how well. I'll point things out here. So we're over here in Rossland, right here, Nelson and Creston, and this is Darkwoods here. So Kootenay Lake, and so it's on the west side of the south arm of Kootenay Lake, and it's totaled about 60,000 hectares. And it was bought by the Nature Conservancy of Canada back in 2008 for conservation purposes, and so that's where a lot of this work is being done. So generally, I think I mentioned already, they live high elevation. You can't see anything there.
Too high.
Too high, yeah. I'll just skip over that since that's not a good visual at all. They can get big. Can you see that? It's a big tree. So this tree was one of the grandmothers. Like it's pretty rare, but they can get to be about that big and up to 30 meters tall. But that tree will be 500 to 1,000 years old before it gets to that size. But the challenge, because it's a pine, it also gets. Anybody recognize what this? Can you see these little jade galleries? This is mountain pine beetle. Yeah. So mountain pine beetle also attacks whitebark pine, natural part of the system, but certainly can be devastating, and was and still is in certain areas. Waterton, for example, was decimated by a number of things. Fire most recently, but before that, a lot of pine beetle. So
those really big ones, what elevation
The really big ones tend to be a little bit lower, sort of 1,800 meters. And that's because they would have survived, they would have come in at a cooler time, so a little ice age, a little bit lower elevation, would have been the same kind of conditions that we have higher up, more like 2,000 meters now. And so it seems like these really big ones are more in the closed forests below the subalpine. And so it's sort of you have a gradient from where it's like that in the closed forest, and then you have it as you go higher up, it starts to thin out, the trees get smaller, and then once you get right at the top, they turn into crumb holes, these little windswept things that can be only knee high and just spread out like that. So it's very plastic kind of growth forms. So this is a tree. Yeah, you can see some raw. This is dark woods, and you would see, if you could see, you'd see a whole lot of dead trees. And so a lot of the trees were killed by mountain pine beetle back in the early 2000s. And this tree here, often what you'll see is dead branches, either red or dead branches, and that's what is usually a sign of blister rust. So the blister rust will, like I say, it lands, if this is a branch, it'll land on the needles, get in the branch, sporulate, and kill everything above it, and then keep on moving down. And then once it gets into the main stem, then it always kills everything that's above it. So it can take 10 or 20 or 30 years after infection before the tree actually dies, because it takes that much time for the rust to grow underneath the bark into that main stem and kill the tree. And so, interesting thing about white, because it's not a commercial tree species, no one cared about it really until about 20 years ago. There wasn't really much, people didn't really recognize it as being a problem. Didn't really know that there was blister rust that was wiping it out. And my first job I took for Parks Canada was just doing blister rust surveys from Waterton all the way up to Jasper, doing surveys everywhere. And it took me a couple of weeks to realize that it was a great species, but it also took me a couple of weeks to realize there was a major problem, because every single stand we went to, we were finding blister rust everywhere. And some places were just rife with it, and other places not so much, but you could tell it was a real problem. But there are solutions, and so that's sort of the exciting part. It's not all doom and gloom. This you can't see either, but this is Mount Robson. It grows as far, and this is a nice, beautiful whitebark pine tree, beautiful mountain, glacier coming down to the lake. It grows throughout the Columbia Basin, all the way up to sort of McBride area, and a little bit north, Wilmore Wilderness, and all the way down to California. So it's one of those species that it's an endangered species because it's so threatened by the blister rust, but there's still millions of individuals out there. And across a huge range, so it's a bit of an atypical species at risk from that perspective. Can't see that either. This is that's in Banff, Crow's Nest. If anybody can, Crowfoot Glacier there, and I can't remember the name of that lake. Beautiful whitebark pine growing in the talus slope around the tree line there. So if you guys probably spend a fair bit of time in the subalpine. Typically it grows in the south-facing slopes, warmer, drier slopes. Often if you're walking along a ridge, you'll have whitebark pine on the south-facing slopes and subalpine larch on the north-facing slopes. And they both, similar type of species as far as the ecology goes, but for whatever reason, larch does better on those north-facing slopes. Whitebark does better on the south-facing slopes. Not as a rule, not categorical, but generally speaking. Beautiful tree. Yeah, it's a slope. So I think this is sort of trying to show that as you're transitioning from the closed forest to the more open forest, and even higher up, you can see like these individuals. These pictures are from Mount Robson, and Mount Robson's super cool because you can see when you're there, you can see the glaciers retreating, and you can, as you're walking there, you can sort of see plants colonizing, primary succession happening. And so we've got some fireweed here, we've got some whitebark there, and that's one of those first pioneer species, certainly a pioneer tree species that comes in either after fire or deglaciation. You can sort of see that, maybe rocky. So yeah, you can see a lot of dead trees, right? So these are those. They're called ghost forests by some people. They like it dry. The drier the better, and I think that's largely because the competition doesn't do well in dry. It competes with subalpine fir and spruce, but those two species need more moisture, and so the realized niche of whitebark is narrower than the potential niche, which is quite broad. You can see seedlings a lot of places, like even lower down to 1,500 meters. You can see little seedlings, often of whitebark pine, but they don't because they only grow, 50, takes 10 years to get to my knees. It doesn't do so well in the closed canopy forest. And so it's actually sort of interesting if you think about the ecology of whitebark pine and climate change. According to some, it could actually be a beneficiary of climate change. It could do better in drier climates, largely because of the competition won't do as well. It can survive in the hot, dry summers, whereas other trees might not be able to do so well. That's a topic of debate, depending on what your perspective is.
So, I guess I always assumed that, and you mentioned earlier in the talk that, they went down as far as 1700 because of the cooler environment. Now they're generally higher because, it's cooler up there.
Yeah.
But now you're saying that they like a hot climate. So
it's not that they like a hot. They can tolerate the moisture deficit. So it's not that they prefer the hot. They can handle it.
Isn't one of the reasons that they're only up at the higher elevations because they need colder temperatures?
It's the lack of competition that they do, I think. Yeah. So I think it could do well in climate change because it's going to have less competition because of all the other tree species dying.
Yeah, I guess I've heard of being threatened by climate change because it's pushing.
Yes. Yeah.
So the ability of the subalpine to have colder temperatures.
Yeah, that's the other school of thought, is that no one knows. It depends whose model you trust.
Yeah.
And whether or not you're incorporating the biological factor, which I'll get into with the birds. Potentially. I don't think, well, the growing season should be lengthened with warmer climates, but higher up. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's an open, like I say, it's a topic of debate, and I say it could do well with climate change, but climate change is also put up as one of the main threats to it. Similar to fire suppression and fire, some people think of it as a cereal species that requires fire to regenerate, and that is often the case in lower elevation forests, where if you're at 1,800 meters, say, and you have a fire to clean everything out, then you could get whitebark regenerating within that fire because of how it goes, how it replicates. But at these upper elevations, it definitely doesn't need fire because it gets killed by fire. It's got super thin bark. If there's any fire, it dies. So, and it doesn't need fire to create the space for it to grow. So depending on where you are, it's a climax species at the top, the cereal species down low. Any birders in the crew? Anybody? Can you guys hear that? Anybody know what that is? Clark's nutcracker. Close to a raven. You got it? Yes, it's a corvid, just like I almost said it's a COVID. It's a corvid, just like a raven. But this is a picture of it right up here, and you can't see anything. It looks like a gray jay with a big beak. Okay, and you'll hear them. They're around here. I've skied up at Red, and you can see them up there. You can hear them up there. It's what they are is obligate mutualists, according to scientists. So what that means, they rely on each other for reproduction. What I call them is evolutionary soulmates, because they evolved together. The way that the cones are is that the cones themselves, they don't open. Like this thing here, this cone would have been closed, and then as it matured, it opens up, and then there's two seeds under each bract that has a little wing, and the seeds fall out, and that's how it disperses. Whitebark pine cones are like little rocks. You can't get in them, except for sort of late in September when they're really ripe. But what the bird does with that big beak is it'll sit up on top of so the branch will be here, and there'll be 3 or 4 cones around here, and the bird will sit on top and start hammering away and picking out all the cones. So they get their beak in here, crack it open, and pull out these seeds, which are, here we go. You can see that. So you can see the bird is right here, and it's sitting on top of the branch, and it's got one of these seeds in its mouth. And the seeds themselves are pine nuts. You guys know what pine nuts are? Very similar species, taste the same, though these are a lot harder to get. But they're super nutritious, full of fat, full of nutrients, and it drives ecosystems where they exist. So where there's high densities of whitebark pine. What's that? It's not their only food source. They eat they eat other seeds largely, and bugs and all sorts of different things, but they do rely on it for successful reproduction. There's a fascinating PhD research that studied whitebark pine cone crops and success of Clark's nutcracker. The cone crops of whitebark pine are very, it's a masting species, so some years you have huge amounts of cones, and other years you have few or none. And it's a strategy of both of the tree itself to produce a whole lot of cones, basically saturate the demand from the birds. So there's only a certain number of birds, and what the birds do is they're hardwired just to collect cones, and they cache them. So they have this sublingual pouch underneath their beak, so they can fill in about 80 to 100 seeds. They're, like I say, they're about the size of a piece of popcorn in this sublingual pouch, and then they fly out on the landscape and they cache them all over the place, hundreds of thousands of them. And throughout the rest of the year, they go back and retrieve those stashes. And it's the stashes that they don't go back and get, or they forget about, that are the ones that regenerate. And it's such a sort of random, it's part of the challenge of finding these things, because the regeneration is dependent on the bird itself. And so there's this one area that in dark woods where there's two they're old cut blocks. They're exactly the same. One of them is just full of naturally regenerated whitebark, and the other one is not. And it's just the bird, right? So maybe there was 2 birds, and this bird over here was killed and didn't go back and get it, and this bird wasn't killed and did go back and get it, and this block gets all the whitebark in this one. So it's sort of a random aspect to the regeneration. So, but to get back to the story about what the Clark's nutcracker needs is that in years where there's lots of cones and seeds available, the following year, so the year that the birds are going back to collect them, they were successfully raising young. In years where there wasn't that food source, they survived, the parents survived, but they didn't have young. They either didn't bother laying eggs or they weren't successful in raising them. So it's the food source that they have stashed across the landscape, full of these really nutritious seeds that allow them to reproduce. In years where there's not a lot of cones, they can get seeds from ponderosa pine and Douglas fir and other species, but they're just little trees that they can survive off, but not enough to make babies. And obviously, so that's the obligate side of things, is that the bird requires the tree, but the tree also requires the bird. The cone itself was designed for that beak. That nutcracker is the only bird that can get in there. Squirrels also go for it, but squirrels, what they do is they cut the whole cone off and they make middens out of it. So they have big piles of middens, and then they spend the winter but that's pretty it's pretty rare, or maybe never does that result in germinating trees. And incidentally, those middens are what grizzly bears love. In ecosystems where there's lots of whitebark pine cones, grizzly bears target whitebark pine, or the squirrel middens for whitebark pine. So the densities around the West Kootenays aren't high enough, but down in Yellowstone, for example, or over in the coast in Lillooet, you'll have grizzly bears spending their time up in the subalpine. Even in Lillooet, there are some bears that'll be up in the subalpine eating cones and not worrying about the salmon down low. In Yellowstone, they found in years where there's lots of cones, there's less human bear conflict, because the bears are all up high where the people are not. And when there's not as many cones, the bears are looking for other food sources down low, and they get into more trouble. So it's really those seeds are really a driver of the ecosystem for this bird, for squirrels, for grizzly bears. Black bears climb trees and just eat the whole cone. I'll get into what I do with the caging of cones. You actually go up to retrieve the cones, and there's a bear's already been up there and eaten all the cones. And there's a large number of other species that also use these cones, like foxes apparently. I think the last count I saw was about 70 different wildlife species across the range eat whitebark pine. Not necessarily as critical, and definitely not as critical as to the Clark's nutcracker, but that is sort of the point of those seeds. And then I don't know if you can see this. This is a little baby tree right here. So that tree would be about that big. And this is in a burnt area. This is a little direct seeding trial I did, where I just planted little seeds. I was being a little bird, planting the seeds just below the surface, and then you come back for the next year and they're that big. You come back 3 years later and they're that big. But more rocky habitat you can't see. This is so annoying. What I'm trying to show you here is the seeds, the cones themselves. So this is in July. So I said this is it's like a bright, right now and for the next month or so, a couple of months, you go up there, they'd be like a bright purple, the cones themselves, and the cones are what I'm looking for. They're bright purple, and you can't get in them. They're like there's a resin that coats them, and it's really hard to crack into them and actually get the seeds. And you can open up the seeds and look inside and see how well developed they are, but really the cone tells you how well developed they are. You go back a couple of months later in September, and you can pull these bracts off with your thumb. They just open up a crack, enough to allow the bird to get their beak in there, open up, and pull out these seeds. And under each one of these, so each cone will have between 50 and 75 seeds. And, yeah. So, like I said, it's recognized about 20 years ago that it's a big problem. It was listed as an endangered species back in 2012, I believe. And now, this is Dr. Michael Murray here up in a tree. He's our forest pathologist out of Nelson. Works for the Ministry of Forests, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development and land and other things. But he's awesome because he's got this program going where we collect, actually I'll get into that a little bit, but basically what he's doing is before the seeds mature, before the nutcrackers start going after them sometime in mid-August, we climb up to the top of the tree, which is where all the cones are growing, and you put these metal cages over top of them. And so if this is your branch, you put a cage over top, and there's a bunch of cones on this branch, put a cage over top and cinch it down here. So you've got a cage over top that's protecting the cones underneath. And then you go back in September when they're mature, you take the cage off, and you have your cones that are then mature. Unless a black bear is gone to get it. So that was Michael Murray just climbing up on his own. Back in 2018, when I got this funding from Columbia Basin Trust, I hired some arborists that climb trees for a living, and they actually did it with ropes and were very safe about it, and incredibly effective and quick at getting a lot of cones. And so now I just got a few pictures of people up in trees. But this is like on a ridge top in dark woods, and he's about 20 meters up, right up there. You're up there sort of swinging in the breeze, trying to put cages on the thing. But it is great fun. More people.
If they didn't put the cages on, there just would be very little success.
There'd be all the cones would be gone. Yeah, I've never seen a cone not eaten. Yeah, it is possible. I shouldn't say that. So when this year in 2018, it was the biggest cone crop that anybody had ever seen. There was people collecting cones. There's maybe a half dozen people in BC that actually do this work, and we were all super excited back in 2018 because it was an incredible year. And that year when we were collecting cones, some cones that weren't caged were still there, but the birds were coming back around, and so like you're up in a tree and you're collecting cones and there's a bird right next to you that's like making that sound at you, getting those last ones. So yeah, ideally you wouldn't have to do it twice because it's expensive, right? You got to climb up there once at the start of the season, and you got to climb up again. If you can find that sort of sweet spot and get up there. But I actually did my undergrad research on that exact question, trying to figure out what the germination was and timing it with when the birds were collecting. So every 2 weeks I would go back and collect cones and try and germinate them, and I was also monitoring when the cones were being harvested by the birds, and the birds know when they're ripe, basically, and they eat them. So it's almost unavoidable to do that. And so you gotta. This is one of the big grandma trees. You gotta climb her up here. It's like a 35-meter tree, one of those big ones at the base. And then you have to go. You can't see this, but this is September in the snow, climbing up the trees to get the cones. It's just, September is a tough time in the subalpine. Sometimes it's beautiful, other times it's not. And so there's the deal. This is me taking the cage off and the cones, and then just to store them to keep them all, because you want to know what cone came from which tree. So I get a basket and just fill it with cones and put a note in on Right in the Rain paper saying this is from tree 653. And then this is in my the basement of my office, and this is, I can't remember what our final tally was, but something like 300,000 seeds within here, and it's enough for almost a decade of restoration. So 2018, and then they last. So they're all in storage at the Surrey Seed Centre. So the seeds themselves, if you dry them out and then you freeze them, they can last for decades. I think there's some degradation, but if you treat them right, they'll be fine. Even these ones, I think you can, if you dry them out, they'll last a couple of years, just like that. In order to get them to germinate, just like any other seed, you have to soak them, and there's a stratification process. It's very complicated because you're basically trying to mimic what happens to the tree in the subalpine. If you think about what happens to that seed, it gets planted in September, October, about 2 inches under the ground or an inch under the ground, then spends the whole winter underground at about 0 degrees or just above, and then the following spring it will germinate. So it's got to get wet in the fall, it's got to freeze for a few months, it's got to get wet in the spring, and then it's got to get warm and germinate. And so in the greenhouse you got to mimic that. You have to there's this running water soak, you put it under running water for 2 days, and then you put it in a cold chamber and put it under running water every 2 days for a couple of weeks, and you put it in cold storage for 4 months, and then you bring it out and do it, and then it's a process. So nurseries don't love it. Some nurseries love it, and most of them don't. It's one of the challenges is getting nurseries to grow large volumes of these trees, and so I don't know if you can see that. But that's my hand with a handful of these seeds. Good question. Most of, yeah, not absolutely everywhere. It's a question we're still trying to sort out. But basically, we think that the genetics, people that do genetics work, believe that you've got probably two populations. We've got coastal and we've got interior or Rocky Mountain. So as long as like these seeds here are good for pretty wide range of areas. It's not just Darkwoods that I collected seeds from. So I've got seeds from several other places in the Boddington Range and up the Slocan Valley and stuff, and then all the way up to Mount Lobson too. But yeah, it's quite transformative. So Red Mountain is planting a bunch of these seedlings this September actually, and those seeds actually came from Darkwoods. So I, as part of this project, donated to the Forest Carbon Initiative, who grew a bunch of seedlings that are planting these seedlings at a few different ski hills in like Red Mountain, Whitewater, Panorama, Kicking Horse, and Revelstoke, I believe, are planting about 5,000 seedlings each. And so Red Mountain is on that list. So these little seedlings are just 1 year old. We plant them as 2-year-old seedlings. We try and get them to be like a decent seedling looking tree. So that takes a couple of years. So if you're thinking about restoration, you've got to go through, you got to collect them, you got to you got to dry them out and do all that, put them through the stratification, then a couple of years in the greenhouse, and then plant them out way up in the mountains, which is logistically challenging as well. A lot of helicopter work depending on where you are. But
the reason for the ski areas, the areas of access, like
I think there's a public education component to it. Trying to bring more partners on board. Just because in the subalpine there's not a lot of people operating. We are working with licensees that are doing some forestry, like Kvesnikov, for example, just planted a few thousand seedlings up close to Castlegar, actually, up in high elevation burn there. But I'm not sure what the genesis of that project was.
But not
Warm, fuzzy feelings. So these, I collected these from Stag Leap Park on Beaten Path. So this is, used to be called Teepee Mountain Native Plants, now it's Nuku Native Plants. And that's over in Cranbrook. They're the ones that are growing all our seedlings for us. They're very excited to actually start producing thousands and thousands of seedlings, which is an awesome thing. You can't see that either, that's too bad. So this is part of that. I mentioned Michael Murray and the rust screening program, where they're trying to figure out whether or not that tree was lucky or if it was actually resistant. I've collected all these, the seeds from each tree, labeled them, and then give them to, this is in a greenhouse in the Okanagan, Kalamalka, where they grow the seedlings, and what they do is they expose all these seedlings to the fungus, to the blister rust fungus. This is where our technology is at these days. They grow a bunch of these ribes where the fungus grows on the leaves. They gather up the leaves, they have it in the right temperature and moisture conditions for the fungus to sporulate. The spores rain down on the seedlings up to a certain point, and then they wait to see which ones die and which ones don't. And so if you were able to see this picture, you would see that there's rows of red and rows of green. Red, red, green. So these guys were just lucky, their parents were just lucky and didn't get killed by blister rust. These ones are actually resistant to blister rust. So we know that these are the ones that we want to go back and collect from, not these ones. And so various different people. Like I say, Columbia Basin Trust is paying for some. Parks Canada is big into this. It's an endangered species, and they're mandated to recover. So Parks Canada is a big contributor, and the BC government is starting to get involved as well. Michael Murray has really led the charge on that, and they're funding this. But it's also there's various funding sources, as with everything. American Forest is I'm not sure what their deal is, but they fund whitebark pine restoration. Yes, all sorts of the 2 billion tree thing, the planting of trees. Justin Trudeau, he's paying for a lot of whitebark as well. So he's going to be planting. We're going to be planting with his money, our money, and where we plant them is in places like this, which you can't see either, but it's a stand of whitebark pine where there's a lot of dead, killed by blister rust. And so I've got a tape out here, transect, where I'm planting every 30 centimeters to follow along. But that's sort of a trial planting as opposed to a operational planting. And the operational planting is what we're getting into. And so what I mean by that is a trial planting is just trying a few here and there and getting our systems down, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And really we've done that over the last 10 years or so. We know what needs to be done and how to do it, and now it's a matter of just ramping it up, and that ramping up is happening now. So this coming September, I'm going to get my first shipment of the 20,000 seedlings to plant. And you can't see it either, but this is a fire on in Darkwoods that's up in the subalpine, southwest facing slope. It's got some whitebark pine that was killed in it, so it's sort of got all the necessary ingredients for a good place to plant. And so I've identified about a half dozen places across Darkwoods to replant plant sort of 3,000-4,000 spot. And the idea being is that you want to get a whole lot of trees that are resistant together, right? So right now they're scattered all over the place and they won't necessarily find each other. But if you have 20 parent trees contributing seeds to this one area, so you've got a 20-hectare area that in 100 years' time will be big enough to start producing cones. They'll be pollinating with each other, right? Because when you're collecting a seed from a wild tree, you're only getting half the genetics from that tree. The other half is from pollen, which is from the air, which could come from anywhere. So what we want to do is we want to put them together so you create these little islands of resistant trees that can produce cones and seeds that then we'll be able to hopefully recolonize the landscape hundreds of years from now once we're all gone, and hopefully Whitebark will be able to come back. So that's sort of the idea there. And the interesting thing with all this is that there is typically what would have happened, and this is a burnt forest up in Mount Revelstoke National Park. Typically what would have happened is that there would have been a lot of seed sources around for the birds to be able to recolonize. But because they've been wiped out largely already, the seed source isn't there. And so that's where the artificial regeneration comes in, where we try and find those areas. And basically natural regeneration you can't necessarily rely on it anymore.
Now you look at the relationship between the nutcracker and the tree. Was there any program to regenerate the birds?
The birds. It's a great question. Not sure what can be done for the birds besides this. But you're right. I mean, it's going to have a potentially serious impact on the nutcrackers as well. And I don't know that research is even younger. Like I say, we've only figured this out in the last 20 years or so, but it's certainly a concern for people that are more concerned. Yeah, it's a challenge. Please don't bark. And then, so once you get to the planting part, it's just like a regular planting show, boxes of trees, dirty tree planters. And then in a case like this, I've got little pin flags so that I can put a little pin flag next to every tree so we know what parent that came from, so that we can go back. And this is actually the block that I went to revisit yesterday or the day before. It was 57. So that's what the trees looked like 8 years ago. So what was I going to say about this one? Nice map. You can see that better?
Yeah.
The pink is, I should point this out, the pink is sort of just my model of where you would expect whitebark pine, and so that's 18 to 2,200 meters, south-facing slope with a minimum of 30% slope, I believe. Sorry, south aspect and a slope of 30%. And so that sort of pink is where you would expect you might be able to find it, but it definitely doesn't mean that you're going to find it there. Like I said, the bird brain is the wild card there. Stagleap Park, you can see there's some down here, and that's certainly accurate, but then there's other ridges where the model says there should be whitebark, but there isn't. And so that's where I'm going to get to a little bit later. So you can't really see this either, but this is in a lower elevation stand, and there are a bunch of whitebark in here. So this is that sort of carrot top, or the broccoli top versus the carrot top. And so one of the other things we do is we do silviculture work on them. We go in there with, depending on how old they are. This stand is about 60 years old when the cones are the trees are just starting to produce cones. We'll go in there and cut down all the other competing trees within 5 meters, just to give that tree the extra space, because you want it to grow big and wide. If it's got competition, it goes up and it's got fewer cones. If it doesn't have competition, its branches go out, you get more cones. And so at this 60, 80-year-old stage, the tree can still respond to that increased amount of space, moisture, nutrients, everything, and produce more cones. Older trees might not be able to do as well, to respond as much. Or you can do it in really young stands with a brush saw. So this is one of those natural regenerated stands. The tree is you can still cut down the competition with a brush saw much quicker. So a brush saw, like a weed whacker, basically with a little blade on the end, and you can go cut down trees up to being about sort of that big. And same kind of thing, you just daylight around it to give that tree extra space. So that's my brother Eric helping me look for whitebark pine. And so what he's looking for is that broccoli shape. He's listening for the nutcracker. The nutcracker will often tell you if you're in the right stand or not. So what I want to know, iNaturalist. Does anybody have iNaturalist? A few of you? iNaturalist. It's an app on your phone. It is like, phones are nice. It's great. Email's great for smartphones, but iNaturalist is the best app, in my opinion, the best app there is, because it is. I can go on for a while, but what it does is it allows anybody to take a picture of a plant. So I could take a picture of this St. John's wort right here, and if it's a decent picture, it'll tell me what it thinks this is. It'll say, we think it's such and such, it's St. John's wort, or it might be one of these other species. And then you say, yeah, it's St. John's wort, you click on it, and then it gets posted on the internet just like that, with the picture, with the location, with the time, if you've taken it with your smartphone. And so whitebark pine, I just took this screenshot a couple hours ago. These are every couple minutes somebody else is uploading a location of a whitebark pine, and so this is all across the range. These people could be anywhere from California up to Smithers, but if what I'm looking for is more healthy trees to collect cones from. So I've got a bunch in Darkwoods here. We've got a lot over in the Rockies. Got a couple over in the Blynston range. We're right in here, not on iNaturalist, but Rossland, which we're somewhere over here in Rossland, right? We don't have anything. So I'm hoping that you guys, as you're out and about, if you can take pictures of whitebark pine, and I will get it. Like it's anybody can access this information. And so how it works is that you take a picture, Sarah, you take a picture of what you think is a whitebark pine. You're not sure, right? You think, I think it's whitebark pine. You say, I don't know if it's whitebark pine, but I will get it, and I can look at the picture, and if you have something that's distinguishing, like ideally the cone, not this is a western white cone, but if you have a whitebark cone, it's very distinctive. I say, yeah, that's a whitebark pine. I click on it, and it says it's research grade. So it requires more than just Sarah to say this is a white, or me, or anybody. I can't just say it's whitebark pine, it's research grade. I need somebody else to confirm it. So it's sort of a double check on that. And so I've got all these spots. These are mine here. This is Stagleap Park, and so these would be some skiers that have this on their phone. They take pictures of it, and when they get back, they load it up, and there it is for people to do what they want with it.
So with that app, you can make your observations to different projects. Do you have a project name that
I don't know. You don't need it for this, because all you have to do, or all you have to. Yeah, exactly. So I just searched whitebark pine. Like I can see right. This is what I did. The species whitebark pine is the filter, and then it'll give me the list of all the whitebark pine within your map extent. But you're right, like you can get real into it. Like Slocan Valley has a bio-blitz, like an ongoing bio-blitz where it's bees. Yeah. It is kind of neat. This is something I just wanted to tell this to you guys because it is something that's becoming more and more used by people like the CICUS, Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society. This is what they use. So if I were to upload that St. John's wort, that's a species they want to know about, it just adds to their database. Similarly, CDC, the Conservation Data Center, there's a species at risk that somebody uploads, they get that information through this app as well. So it's something that I was a little skeptical of at first, but just listening to other organizations have really taken it up and just playing around with it, it's really effective for a lot of different things. Helps you learn new species. You can if you take a picture of a species that's really distinctive, like a butterfly. And it's a good picture. The AI, the artificial intelligence, will tell you what they think it is. You look it up, say, oh yeah, and then you learn something. So I learn stuff new every day by using this. I don't know if you can upload animal tracks. Remember? And does it ID the sound as well? Oh, nice. In Castlegar?
I've never seen one, but now I know.
And Lewis, that's actually, I was looking at Lewis's woodpecker on that, and that's how I discovered that there was Lewis's woodpecker in Castlegar. In Kimberley, right. So this is actually becoming, the species maps, the range maps you can get from this app are becoming better than anything else for a lot of species.
So for us, like the Rossland range, would it be better if it's closer to the ski hill because it's easier to access, or it doesn't matter?
I'll take anything, but certainly the access, so the components of a good collection site are the easier to access, the better. It's a real challenge. Like some places you can only fly to, some places require all day to hike, and some places, not around here, you can drive to. But another, like down in the States, they have places you can just drive to and collect cones from. But what I'm looking for is something that's reasonably accessible, you can hike to in a couple hours or less. Fairly large stand if possible, just so you have more options. And then it's got cones, and the trees have to be climbable as well. So generally you want to have trees that are that might have been broken, because actually some of the best collecting I've done is in avalanche paths up around Lake Louise, because you have these big trees that every 10 or 20 or 40 years an avalanche will come down and break the tree off, but the tree itself is still ancient, and the shoots come up, and then the branches are from ancient trees and they're producing cones. I can reach them. That's how I did my undergrad research. I didn't climb trees, I just found a spot where they were all broken.
And
so
would inside Kokanee be okay or not because it's inside?
I collect some bricks. Yeah. Kokanee is there's not a lot of whitebark in Kokanee. There's a little bit. There is, eh?
I participated in that.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time up there, but it feels it's a bit wet. Like whitebark it seems to be a bit drier. But there's pockets everywhere. So definitely, I don't know how much there has been done in Kokanee. I don't see any observations up in Kokanee, so please bring it on. Yeah. So now's the time where I give you a few more places to get some information. How's my time going? Yeah. So the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. Tons of I'm on the board here. There's a ton of resources here about whitebark pine, if you need seeds, for example, whether you go, we can sort of help you find seeds, information on management, all this stuff. And then Nature Conservancy of Canada, whom I work for, we've got a little bit of whitebark pine stuff. This is a picture of dark woods. You can get a little bit of information there. That's it. This is a picture. I think you can see the Valhalla here. This is just north of Castle. Yeah. So that's all I've got to say, besides answering any questions you guys have. I know you've been firing them off as we go, but yeah.
About the cages.
Yes.
What are the cages on? Did you say that the birds will get all of them?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you want to find where the keys are, and you put a cage up and you put a key.
That's right.
Wow.
It's fun.
Those birds are wow.
Yeah, they're tenacious, and they're kind of like my frenemy. You know, I really appreciate the work they do, but I don't want them necessarily to take all my seeds. Right? They are the main disperser of whitebark pine, but they also predate on the seeds that I want.
Are the birds territorial? Do they kind of go to one cluster and that's where they live and return to?
Good question.
Or do they kind of go from cluster to cluster? What I'm leading to is catching some of the birds and put a radio tracker on it.
Yeah.
And then just follow the birds.
Yeah.
Leading to the birds.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think there's both. So it's not a permanent territory, but I think there's sort of residents, and then there's rovers. But
Kind of like the Great Day.
yeah, I'm not a lot. I'm clearly not a bird person. I'm a tree guy, so I can't answer a lot of your questions about that. But I think generally they've found that the birds are they move a lot. They're birds, which is great. So if there's no cones in an area, they won't stick around.
Right.
But I don't think they're not territorial, like they're not chasing other birds out. But they will, for example, there will be if there's a resident bird, the bird will plant quite close, and if they're not a resident bird, they'll fly up to 30 kilometers away. So they could fly all the way to that next mountain range over with a sublingual pouch full of seeds and plant them over in their home range. And so that's what the sort of dispersal mechanism is. You've got the wind disperse of the pollen, but then the seeds get dispersed by the birds. Yeah. Well, full stands of whitebark pine. There's not a lot of like pure stands of whitebark around here. There just isn't. If you're willing to travel further, there's places in the East Kootenay and the Rocky Mountain parks are excellent. There's some great places there. But around here, I haven't up Grassy Mountain in the Byington Range. You can get fairly close there and hike up. There's a decent stand there, but I've never around here. I haven't found a place where there's like a stand. You're willing to travel? Awesome. Yeah, Lillooet is great. Yeah, the high elevation around Lillooet.
You probably said this earlier in the presentation, Adrian, but if you had to give people in general the top 3 reasons that they want to protect trees.
Well, it depends on what you care about. If you like the birds, you want to save the birds. If you care about sort of the ecosystem in general, it's a keystone species, right? That the seeds themselves are so important to the ecosystem. It's once you lose whitebark pine, the habitat quality for grizzly bears goes down. So if you like your grizzly bears, you want to keep your white bark. If the they're sort of a pioneer species, you can see they grow up here. This will eventually turn into a tree, which will drop needles, create soil for other trees to grow. So it's sort of that pioneer tree species that helps forest develop. There's research done on with climate change, and you can see moving up the trees moving up slope, and the white bark is often leading the way. The white bark is leading the way up the slope. So they're often the first tree to come in up high, and then other trees will form. Pushing the alpine higher, yeah. So that climate change thing is, if you just think that it's going to go higher, eventually it's going to go off the top of the mountain. Right? There's no more mountain to go up. So that's where the threat of climate change is thought to exist, but that's not, like I said before, it's not necessarily true because of the relationship with other trees and with the birds, the competition and the regeneration, dispersal.
I've been doing research with them down in the States, and whether they come back when they've had those severe, very hot fires in California.
I'm not familiar with really severe fires in California, but certainly in the States they're doing this in a big way as well. They're ahead of Canada for sure. The numbers of seedlings that they're planting is way beyond what we're doing. They've got it figured out, and we're trying to catch up as with so many things.
And I wondered about volcanic activity as well. Somewhere like Mount Helens. I mean, I haven't been there for years.
Yeah.
But I was there a couple of years after the eruption, and I couldn't believe how quickly the scrub willow and the fireweed and stuff were all coming up.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't know anything about that. It's a good. I would imagine it would be if I'm not. I don't know. Stop talking.
Don't go there.
No, you can go there. There's just not a lot of. There's no trails. Yeah. It's a lot of. There is, okay, so in Darkwoods itself, you can sort of write about, there is if you go online, Google Darkwoods access, and you can get up to the top of Mount McGregor. It's a fire lookout right there, and there's lots, it's actually maybe the best whitebark stand. If you want to see whitebark, that might be the place to go. It's a heck of a drive. It's about 40 kilometers of logging road and then driving up to the top. So it takes about 2 hours. 2 hours from Nelson anyway. Hour and a half to 2 hours from there. But there's lots of whitebark pine at the top, and there's an old fire lookout there where you can see all the way up the lake and all the way down to Creston, all the way across the Bugaboos, and you can see the Valhallas over here. You can see Copeland Glacier. Pretty great spot. The campgrounds, like the campgrounds along the lake, yeah. I mean, so there's a campground right there in Ty. There's a campground Midge, I believe, and that's next creek. But the challenge is that you're going up 2 vertical kilometers from the lake. So the lake's at about 400 meters, and this is at 2,200 meters. So that's a good day. Yeah, you can. But the nice thing about this thing is you can drive to it almost all the way to the top. As far as the rest, access to the rest of Darkwood, you do come up about over this pass right here, Porcupine Pass, at about 1,700 meters, and there are some whitebark up here. There's some nice lakes you can hike into. and then you drive, so you go up to the top of the pass and then all the way down to tie in. And there's another road that goes through to the Kootenay Pass there. But they're gated, but the gates are open. You need so if you want to go to Dark Woods, you can just Google Dark Woods access, and then there's you download an access permit. You fill it out and send an email to the thing, and you're good to go. So the gates are open. The only gate that's closed is we've got a gate down here by Creston to access this area, and I just lock it because people from around there weren't respecting the land very well. Oh yeah, that like some lake campground there. Yeah. You can. Indeed. Yeah, there's a hiking trail. So we're talking right here. So that little triangle there is another NCC Nature Conservancy property called Midgley that you can walk through the wildlife management area. But you're still, and you can sort of get around to here, but you're sort of in that little corner far away from Whitebark Pine. So why would you?
In terms of increasing awareness, do you guys do anything with kids at schools, or get kids out doing any planting or anything like that? Is that possible?
It's possible, but it's not with kids. I haven't with kids. It's a lot. First of all, just the access. You don't want to drag a kid out 2 hours and logging road. It's more college students, grad students. What's that? My kids will do it. I drag my kids out, but yeah, I haven't done a lot of public engagement stuff. It's just a lot of work, and I'm only one person. That's all me. Oh, for the planting? Yeah. The planting is real challenging often because there's not a lot of soil where you want them to plant, so they're like banging their shovel in a rock quite a bit. So you want to get some experienced planters that know how to find the right microsites. When you're planting these little trees in the burned areas, they need a little bit of shade. So often, like a nutcracker will plant a seed next to a stump or a rock or something visual that they can cue off. So the nutcracker will, once they plant some seeds, they'll fly back and sort of triangulate. They have way better memory than all of us combined, probably. And they'll plant the seeds and they'll go back and then they'll sort of triangulate, and they remember that, and they come back 6 months later and sit back on the branch. Say, oh yeah, there's my seed. But they cue off of those visuals. And they would, so they plant next to something that will also protect them from, like next to a stump, protects them from snow creep, because as you skiers know, snow will come down the hill and can rip trees and little seedlings out. So it protects them from that and protects them from drying out in the first couple of years where they're most.
So do you figure that they're doing this dispersal thing because, as you said, they're
evolutionary soulmates?
So that, yeah, like, I mean, it would be a lot easier if they just put all the seeds in 1 or 2 spots and then just go back there, right?
Then you're putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
Which
the fact that they disperse them in so many places, I mean, obviously, maybe they're not so cognitive of what they're doing that's good for the trees, but
yeah,
obviously it is.
it's not who knows what's going on in the bird brain. But I think you're right. It's not the intention of them. It's just what they do.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the whole window. I find studying a system really closely and understanding that it has much wider applications in different areas, but just sort of realizing how much different species depend on each other and how they've really evolved, like the shape of the tree and the shape of the cone and how it's all for the bird. It's bright purple so the bird can see it. It's built like that so the bird can sit on top, and it's closed like that so the bird is the only one that can get his beak in there to get in the seed. It's amazing, and it's just one of those stories that humans can understand, and there's countless other ones that go on that we don't know about yet. Great. Thank you all for coming, really. And if you do end up doing any of the iNaturalist stuff, I will see it. And I might even contact you through that iNaturalist app.